Hey YouTube, what's up? Dr. T here, and welcome to the Altcoin Express and my hometown of St. Petersburg, Florida.
So, in this section, we will deal with all things pertaining to artificial intelligence, otherwise known as AI.
So GitHub, it is a cloud website in which you get an account in which you can import code. And this is my GitHub. And the project I'm working on, Good World. Just give you a brief look. And one of the latest versions in. And it places your code in here. And it's nicely arranged. And other people can interact with it, and so on and so forth.
GitHub. It all started the history when two guys founded the company. There's actually a third founder, and he's kind of quiet, but it was Tom Preston Warner and Chris Wanstroth. They come together to form. This week on Case Studies with the BizDoc, it's GitHub. $7.5 billion check was just written from Microsoft to buy the company. Are they going to rot on the vine, or is Microsoft going to take them even higher? We're going to find out this week. Leave comments. Tell me what you think. GitHub. It all started the history when two guys founded the company. There's actually a third founder, and he's kind of quiet, but it was Tom Preston Warner and Chris Wanstroth. They come together to form GitHub. Well, what is a Git and what is a hub of them? Well, what GitHub is, it's a consolidation point and it's a tracking point for software development. A Git is actually a version control mechanism or a team coordination mechanism that was developed by Linus Torvalds. By the way, that's the same Linus that brought us Linux. So you know he's a really, really smart guy. So you have this tracking mechanism need. You need to control versions. You need to get software developers tools so they can work together. Well, GitHub says, what if we made something in the cloud where they could store their code, keep track of versions, keep track of each other, talk to each other, sign off when they finished maybe an open source element for it. In other words, hey, I just adapted your code for this and I'm signing off as it's complete. So they had all of this coming together. In other words, it's a sandbox where developers around the world can come together and work and make magic that you and I love. And companies like, Facebook, IBM, a whole mess of others use it to bring the magic to software and apps and products that we depend on every day. So let's go up the history curve and see how they grew, starting with the bright idea and moving up. In 2009, they had about 46,000 developer accounts that were in place, which was pretty amazing because they just got started in 08 and they basically bootstrapped it with their own money. A year later, they had gotten up to about 100,000. But halfway through 2010, a year after that, they were already at 1 million. Something was going on and the world was watching and paying attention. Specifically, a year later, when they hit 2 million total user accounts and they passed SourceForge and Google to other repositories that allowed developers to work together, store code, and do things like that. And when it's time to grow, what do you need? You need capital. You need venture cash. And who they get with? None other than Andreessen Horowitz. That's right, Mark Andreessen, the developer and inventor of the original Netscape browser, who knew a thing or two about what developers would appreciate and need. And what they did is they put in $100 million for about 13% of the young GitHub company. And I say young because it's only a few years old, but it's passing some industry giants. An interesting tidbit there is at that time, that was the largest check ever written to date by Andreessen Horowitz, $100 million. From there, the growth continued. Let's check it out. 2013, suddenly they've blown right past 3 million and they're at 5 million unique user accounts. It's really off like a rocket, and it's taken on a global presence. There are developers around the world that are storing code in there, and sometimes they're storing versions to a lot of things that weren't appealing to certain governments. As we go into 2014, things are speeding past 5 million toward 10 million accounts, and something interesting happened. First, India decides to block them because they had some documentation on there that was related to ISIS, and the Indian government did not like that and did not want it to be circulated to developers or other people who might be using GitHub for their own purposes. Also, in Russia, they were very upset because there was like a suicide manual that had been put online, and Russia wanted to block access to it. In 2015, halfway through the year, China gets upset, and China wants to block GitHub for a very simple reason. They were presenting how to avoid internet censorship. Now, if you know anything about the Chinese government, you know, there was a major WTF going on in Beijing when they heard that that sort of information is out there. They're trying to shut down cable channels and objectionable programming and websites. And, you know, I got to say, China, in the age of the internet, you're going to be playing whack-a-mole till the return of Christ, because get used to it. When one goes down, another's coming up. Nonetheless, it shows you the power and influence that GitHub was having as an enabler of teams of people to come together and collaborate and keep track of versions and all of the features that were part of GitHub. In July of 15, this success led to a need for more capital, and they went out and they raised $250 million. That's right, $250 million. And they raised it from none other than Sequoia. Now, there's an interesting thing here that I'd like to point out. If you take a look what I got here, 13% was what Andreessen Horowitz had. Had Andreessen Horowitz not had what's called a top-up right, in other words, the right to invest more at a later date to keep my 13% at 13%, they would have actually gone down to 11.4%. But they kept their top-up right, which meant that these numbers came together, Sequoia with 12.5 and Andreessen Horowitz with 13. Now, why is that important? Because by this time, it is a rare thing that an entrepreneur would still have 75% of the company for the founders and the engineers and the people that normally by this time it's completely flipped. There's about 25% left for management, and there's 75% in the hands of the investors that go through the sequential Series A, Series B, Series C, which is using letters merely to number the investment tranches that happen over time of the company. So GitHub is doing pretty good out in the marketplace, and they also did pretty good because they bootstrapped the company basically, and when they got to these points, when they took capital, they were highly valuable, so they only gave up relatively small percents compared to what other companies would be giving up. That is an important lesson. You can raise capital too late and miss opportunities to invest in things, and you can also raise capital too early and give away more of your company early on when maybe you should have reached down deep and bootstrapped or used any of the many crowdsourcing options that might be available to you. Don't be too anxious to raise that capital, but don't pass up opportunities to raise capital to grow. Therein is the tension that every entrepreneur will face. So after you've raised that money, how are they doing? Well, a report came out in 9 months of 2016. It got disclosed that they had actually had approximately $99 million in revenue for the first 9 months of 16, but they had lost $68 million, showing that building a global GitHub to serve all these millions and millions of accounts was not cheap. However, this is showing the kind of scale when you've got the dollars to actually weather those losses as you scale. It puts you in a good place, because let's take a look what was happening to the number of user accounts. Number of user accounts was heading to the moon, had passed 10 million in 14-15, and by the time they reach early 17, after this loss, which was the first 9 months of 16, they were at 20 million plus user accounts. Well, now that they raised this money to propel them on future growth curve, and certainly they were using it as they went past 10 million subscribers and were heading toward the moon, after 9 months of 2016, it was indicated that they had actually had revenue of $99 million. However, they had a loss of $68 million, which means the cost in the middle, $167 million of cost against $99 million of revenue, resulting in this loss. So this is what's interesting about growing and scaling companies. Sometimes losses are okay. Twitter did it for a long time. Uber's been doing it since Uber's been around. And we all know what happened to Amazon, that finally over time they posted profits. So if you can control the spend and weather the loss as you're growing toward the moon, this is something that you can actually sustain. So what I want to step to now, we've talked about the history. Very briefly, I want to talk about a flub that happened to the founder back a couple years ago, and this is before all of the Me Too movement and things that were going on. Tom Preston Werner, his wife is working with him at the company, and there is a female developer that says They're treating me badly. They're treating me harshly. I'm being harassed. He's very dictatorial. He gives feedback in a very demeaning way. So it wasn't sexual harassment, but it was like a hostile workplace, a terrible environment, and she became fed up and she filed a complaint. Well, the first thing they did, like everybody else did, is nothing to see here. This is a disgruntled employee. Obviously, these are outrageous claims. Well, guess what? They spent a couple weeks researching it, and the board came to a conclusion that said, you know what? The wife wasn't supposed to be working here. We had an agreement with Tom, number one. Number two, these charges have some merit. So guess what? I think even though he's a co-founder of the company and he owns a big stack of stock, out. And Tom Preston Warner resigned. If you call resigning walking toward the door with the board pushing you on the shoulders, resigning, but nonetheless, he resigned. So now you've got bye-bye. There's a lesson here. You can lose it all. Just because you're the founder doesn't mean that you can be a putz when it comes to giving people feedback or just ignore the fact that people's feelings and professionalism are important. And frequently you find people say, hey, if you want to be here and you want your stock options and you want part of this, I am who I am, leave me alone. Guess what? That doesn't fly anymore. And it doesn't fly when you've got harsh emotional harassment, and it certainly doesn't fly, as we've seen, thank you Matt Lauer, thank you Harvey Weinstein, with the Me Too movement uncovering things that have been going on far too long. I digress. Let's get back to GitHub in this situation. Well, guess what? You have 2 years after this happened in 2017, you still had a little bit of collateral damage here, as there were claims that he had set a culture in place and not everything was rosy. So there was a few more dynamics that came here that supposedly it was handled. But it's an example of, even with Uber, just because Travis has left the company, there were still people that were in there that were made in Travis's image, hired by Travis and upset that he was gone, that hadn't really changed the way they were treating other people and that they were acting. And so they've had to be dealt with as well. So in other words, you can ask a co-founder to leave, but it doesn't necessarily change a culture overnight. Lesson to entrepreneurs, set your culture early. It can be a culture of high accountability and performance and the demands to hit objectives. You just got to treat the people in the correct way and manage yourself accordingly, because it can and will bite you even if you've got $350 million of investment from Andreessen Horowitz and Sequoia. So you've got a company that's been growing like crazy. You've got a board that's done the right thing to help the work environment be healed. And you've got, with all this success, what do you attract? Attention. And attention from who? From Microsoft. And the 28 million developers and the 1.8 million businesses that were working with GitHub at the beginning of 18, Microsoft was the most active among them. In other words, Microsoft had found, says, hey, this GitHub thing works. And they had several of their own products and product groups using GitHub for collaboration and using it to help developers collaborate, which is kind of interesting because there's a lot of people that say, wait a minute. Microsoft's been trying to kill open source. Why would they be using or in favor of something that helps collaboration? Well, the times they are a-changing, and Microsoft is changing. Maybe not as fast as some people want, but they are changing. How do we know? Well, they wrote a $7.5 billion check. This is 3.75 times more value just 3 years later, and there's only one word for that, and that is damn. Now let's take a look at a couple of the reasons that Microsoft has actually published as for the additional rationale. First of all, they said we need to be developer focused. And if this is the leading tool in the known universe for doing something like this, then we need to be in, and why wouldn't we own it? Additionally, they took Nat Friedman, who's the corporate VP of developer relations. He's going to be plugged in as the division president or CEO of GitHub when the deal closes. You also take a look at cloud, and you look at the amount of effort that Microsoft already was putting in being an active user, and suddenly this starts to make sense. So time will tell whether Microsoft pulls it off or it's the old Microsoft, they're going back to their old ways, and GitHub dies a terrible death.